This episode of Working in Music Sucks is brought to you by Plug and Alley's weekly recall newsletter. Get tips, tricks, updates on sales, and so much more weekly. You can find a link to sign up in the description of this episode wherever you're listening. Now, let's get to the show. Plug and Alley presents Working in Music Sucks, the show where we talk about what sucks about working in music so you don't have the same problems. I'm your host, John Maciel, and if you're a returning listener, glad you're back. And if you can do us a favor and drop a like if you're watching this podcast on YouTube, or leave a positive review on iTunes, we greatly appreciate it, as it helps us reach more people who can benefit from this podcast. And if you're brand new, well, glad you're here. And in today's episode, my friends, we're going to be talking about something that can really help elevate your career. And so many producers and mixers that I've known throughout the years never know when and how to do this. So I wanted to tackle this subject of when to know when to outsource. And if you're not familiar with the term outsource, I'm going to paint you a picture. You are booked solid for 6 months, and it is just you doing all the tracking, the editing, the production, the mixing, all of it. That you are a one-man shop working 16 hours Monday through Sunday every single week. Then, if that sounds like a dream to you, congrats. You have no social life. But for most people, that's a recipe for burnout and disaster. So the value in knowing when it's time to outsource is having people on a team to support you, essentially. So there's different ways to look at outsourcing. A lot of people they think there's like a golden merit badge for doing everything yourself, when that's just not the way the world works. I don't know why so many producers and mixers I've ever encountered find a benefit, or not a benefit, but they find value in being able to say, oh yeah, I did it all myself. I know I was like that in my early years, but as I got older, I was just like, I need to figure out a system that's going to help me not burn myself out, essentially. And, there's jobs like assistance jobs for a reason, because you want to outsource certain duties to your assistant when you get to a certain point. So if you're asking yourself, okay, well, I'm not booked for 6 months. How do I know when it's time to outsource? And it really comes down to knowing what your time is valued at and what are you actually good at doing. So if you're a mixer, then you do your best work when you're mixing, right? When you're actually mixing the song and getting things to fit and then doing automation and all that fun stuff. So mix prep and all that maintenance work of making sure the files were delivered right, that you have all the files in the session, that everything's lined up accordingly. All that stuff is going to eat at your brain RAM, right? And over time, it's just like you lose the motivation to mix because you have to do the prep work. So a way that can help you is to outsource the mix prep, train someone to understand how you like things mix prepped. And whenever you get a record or a single, you're like, all right, cool. Can you prep these songs for me? They get prepped, and then the next day you go in and you start mixing. So one of the things that I did for a long time was do a lot of mix prep jobs for a lot of different mixers, and it was really interesting to see how much value a lot of mixers are always apprehensive of someone else getting into their flow, because they're like, oh, I want to explain my flow, and I also don't want someone to slow me down. And it does take a certain personality type to be able to be sent like a session. They're like, okay, this is a mix session, and I need the rest of the tracks for this EP or album prepped so that I can just continue with the mix. And it takes you have to have kind of like a mindset for puzzles and kind of look at the work that was done and reverse engineer it. Because a lot of the time in the situations I've encountered, mixers don't really take time to show you things besides like, oh, I like to use this, and this. Like, it's very preliminary stuff. It's never, you go for a day and you get a whole walkthrough and then you guys are there in a room together working together. It does not work like that in a real world scenario. Unless you were like an intern that was brought up in the studio, then maybe. But for the most part, whenever I've been hired to do mix prep, it was, hey, I have like this EP or this record, and I get sent the single, or like what I call the master session, which is essentially the rest of the record is going to be based off the template that this song was mixed. And this template was approved by the band. Basically, the mixer made the single, the first song of the record, sent to the band, and the band was like, yes, this is the direction we want the record to go in. So from that point on, that session acts as your master template or your compass, essentially, for the rest of the record. So as a mix prep assistant, what you do is you're given access to that session, and you kind of go through and kind of see how files are organized, color coded, samples that they're possibly using, samplers that they're possibly using, amp sims if they're using any, or if it's printed amp tracks, buses, all that stuff. And depending on what DAW you're on, you can make a template that has all the buses, auxes, all that other stuff. And you can import that into a new session and then import the files from the next few songs on the track. Because usually when you're sent, it can go either way. You're usually sent a session from the producer and the band, and then you have to organize it and clean it up, and or you're sent audio wave files. Either way, you have to organize all that stuff. But another part to it too is you need to actually go through and see if there's like gain staging, what the gain staging on the tracks were for that session. So for example, if the band recorded live drums, sometimes live drums aren't all recorded on the same day. Sometimes pieces of gear fail, and then the type of pre is switched out and no one makes note of it. No one says anything. They just continue the session. So your job is to kind of know audactically what do the tracks sound like from that master session, so that when you're bringing in other tracks and you're putting in the tracks in the template, you have an ear for, oh, this is a different preamp on this snare, or the snare has something different. So they probably switched out the snare. And making a note of it in the session, but also bypassing the plugins in the chain, because those plugins may need to be changed significantly. And it allows the mixer to know when he pulls up the session, he sees the notes, you let them know. And then also they see this, the plugins are bypassed. So like this, again, this is all based on their workflow. You're going to have to figure that stuff out. And you just let them know, yeah, looks like the track 5 and 7 used a different snare and kick. So I bypassed the processing so that it wouldn't affect your playback, and you can kind of mess with things from there so you wouldn't hear it back and think something's immediately wrong. And they could be like, oh, next time just leave it on, just let me know and I'll tweak it from there. It kind of depends on what they want. But you're making note of these changes within the tones, because if they make a master template based on the drum samples that they selected, those drum samples now need to either be retuned, reshaped, or maybe swapped out for something different to fit this particular song. But it doesn't slow them down as much. And you as a mix prep assistant need to be very, very conscious and aware of that. And when you're really good at doing that and noticing like, oh, I'm going to create MIDI just in case they need it for sidechain or sampling or anything like that, you're taking the initiative to do it. Whether or not the mixer uses or not, that's not your, that shouldn't matter. Just you going the extra step to make sure that's taken care of. Maybe you notice some drum tracks are a little bit too noisy, so you create a duplicate and you call it a gated track, and then you mute it, and the mixer can decide if they want to use it, and or sometimes they'll just take certain sections of that gated track that you did and then pull it up to the other track, and you just saved them time. And by saving them time, they're able to be like, you know what, I can do more mixes in a month now because I have this mix assistant that just is amazing and awesome. It makes my life so much easier, and I can get them a certain percentage of each record we're doing because they're so equipped and inept in knowing what we need to get done. And also being a mix prep assistant, you need to be really good at detail and nuances in terms of, are things edited right? Are things tuned right? Are you good at vocal tuning and drum editing and guitar? Like editing in general is such a crucial skill. But you can see we're outsourced. Imagine being the mixer and all the things I've just described doing as a mix assistant. Imagine being the mixer and you're still doing all this, and then you have to go and mix a track. Everything I just described probably exhausted you just listening to all that. You're like, that is so much shit. And it's like, when you are making records at a certain level, that's just the attention to detail you have to have. There's no exception to it. But when you're doing all of it, it's exhausting. Like, and you're not going to make your best mixes. That's the biggest thing, is if you don't learn to outsource and let go of certain things and give them to people, you're not going to make the best product for your artist, and you're not going to make the best product that represents yourself. And ultimately, when you put stuff out into the world, once it's approved by the band, that is your resume. And that resume never goes away or never gets outdated, because people always come back to those records and listen. And, you know, if you made a record that didn't sound so great, someone's going to ask, so what happened on that record? And, you might be like, honestly, we were crunched for time. We did the best we could. The band was fine with it. But I wish I would have done things differently. Like, that's like the worst thing you would ever have to say about your record. But unfortunately, a lot of mixers get put into that position, and producers, because they don't think about outsourcing, and they don't think about it before they get busy. So one of the rules I like to think of is like, However busy I am now, imagine myself 5 to 10 times busier. What are things that I don't want to do or taking up my time that someone else could do for me? Another way of thinking about this is if you're really bad at finances and collecting money and deposits and then scheduling and stuff, hiring someone to be an assistant in terms of like your studio assistant or your studio manager, and they're the ones that are contacting, the bands hit you up and they're like, yeah, this sounds great. I'm going to send you over to the studio manager now, and they're going to take care of the booking and everything else. And then you have another third party who represents you, but they're the ones in charge of collecting payment, making sure that the band knows what time is their time slot and all that stuff. Who's doing what at what time? What are the rules to the studio? And that could be a job where it's depending on how busy you are, they're only doing it for a couple hours, depending on what the particular artist needs and what the project demands. But you can see how not having to deal with what I call the housekeeping can be such a benefit to you being able to focus on producing the record, recording the record, all that stuff. Like anything that's going to distract you or take time away from you focusing on the bread and butter of what you do and what actually brings people through the door to work with you, that is what you should solely be focused on, and figuring out, how do I budget my projects so that I can hire someone to come in and assist me part-time on the little things that I just don't want to handle and do, because thinking about this stuff is just exhausting. Like hunting down payments is not fun. And I'm really big on, just get someone to be your like folly manager. Like have a friend that's responsible, that you're like, look, this is what I need help with. I can give you like $100 per band just to make sure I get my deposit, make sure the dates are taken care of, and I get the final payment before the masters are sent out. I just need a third party so it seems more official. How do you feel about doing that for like $100 a project, or like 200, 500, something reasonable between the two of you? And you will not believe how much easier life is when you are not the one that's handling all that. And with artists and bands, I don't know what happens, but when you say you have a manager, even when you're a small producer mixer, but you just say, I have a manager that handles this stuff, all of a sudden, even if you were acting professional before, for whatever reason, when you say manager, they like the switch goes on. They're like, oh shit, like this is like official, so we have to like follow certain rules now. And it's so much easier to get shit done when you were representing yourself and doing it. For some reason, it's always lax. I have not been able to figure out an explanation. It could be because part of getting the artists in the studio is you build rapport with them, and they kind of think of you, and you want them to think of you as your friend. But for a lot of people, separating friend from business associate is just very difficult for people to do in general. So I can see why, actually saying this out loud now, I can see why for bands, when they have that manager or third party that intervenes to collect payment, it's much easier for them to be like, oh, we have to adhere to some sort of authority level. So, okay, cool. And also it helps you kind of be like, away from like the details of the business, like, oh, I don't want to worry about collecting payment and stuff. And then also another thing, make sure your friend's not one of those people that's going to be like, oh, why are you getting like $5,000 and I'm getting, $500? And it's like, well, you're getting, a percentage of closing the deal. Like you're not doing, I'm doing all the work. You're just doing a percentage of it. And if you want, we can go find you another mixer, so you can now have like 3 or 4 mixers that you're working for. That's how mixers get managers. Like they all take a percentage cut of everything, and other stuff too, but that's for the most part. But ultimately, when it comes to outsourcing, you just want to really focus on like what is the thing that you do really, 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 really well, and how can you find someone else to support you and help you, and not have to worry about those things. Now, if you're wondering like, okay, cool. Well, how do I find these people? So there are so many forums online, on Facebook, on Reddit, where you can just like post like, hey, I need an editor. So what I recommend everyone who's listening that's going to take this advice seriously, what I recommend you do is a project that you've already done. Let's say you want to outsource drum editing and drum MIDI. You need to have a little pile of cash, like, $300 or something, and posting these forums like, hey, I need an editor for a project. They don't need to know that you've already done the edits and the project's already done. You just have the raw files, and you pick 3 people, and from there, you pay them like 50, 75, $100 just to like edit some drums as a tester, but they don't know they're being tested. What you're doing is you're trying to figure out, okay, out of these 3 people, who is the one that stands out? You begin the 100, and now you have someone to keep in your reserves, essentially. So when you do have a project coming up, you're like, this person could probably do this job pretty well. But you do that for every task you can think of. And yes, it's going to cost you money because you're essentially trying people out, but because it's just nice to like pay people for their time instead of just like, oh, do you want to like try to see if you can do it? And you want to have like a good pool of people. You're like, oh, actually these 2 people are really good at editing drums. Hey, how are you at guitars? Oh, I'm all right. Or, oh, I can edit everything. No problem. So now you have one person you can go to for almost everything. And then you have specialists who only specialize in like drums, guitar, bass edits, or vocals, production, etc. And you want to find production people. You want to find people who are specialists in one particular thing so that when you have a project that comes on board, and you're like, man, I don't have time to edit this record. So to make the deadline, so I'm going to charge this much for the record. I'm going to hire this person to edit all the drums, and you create a system and you outsource it. So like, okay, cool. I don't have to worry about drums anymore. I can just focus on making this record sound great, getting the tracks to sound great. And then someone else will tighten the drums up or tighten everything up. And now I can focus on producing a better record because I'm not taking care of the other tasks that just drain me. You're still going to oversee and review, but you can see how being able to find people to outsource prior to when you need them can help you alleviate a lot of that stress of the project that comes on. And so many producers and mixers I know always wait until the project's in front of them to like then ask for help. And then they give these ridiculous deadlines of like, I need it in 24 hours or I need it in a week or whatever. And you're like, cool. And then the pay is not that great because the project's already set in stone. So when you do this beforehand, you're able to take into account that you're going to outsource. So your budget reflects you paying for someone outsourced. So if you're going to, bring in someone to help you edit an EP that's 4 songs and you're going to charge $5,000, you can be like, all right. And 1,000 of this is like 1,000 of that 5,000 grand is for editors. And then the other 4 is my gross before all my like taxes and everything like that, which I think in another episode talk about if you're charging 4, cut that in half because that 2 that is for you and the other 2 is for savings for taxes for the tax man, wherever you're at, depending on how you're organized as a business. So that is a really short, simple episode. Outsource. Stop being a one-man shop thinking you have to do everything yourself and that you're only going to get credibility if you do everything yourself. So asinine to think that like no successful business in history has been built by one person doing every single job. Every successful business owner, because you are a business, understands you need to delegate the tasks that slow you down from focusing on what actually drives the revenue. As gross as that might feel for you to think of money and revenue, yes, we all love music. It's our passion. We all are very passionate about this thing. But at the end of the day, it takes money to fuel the mission. And if you're not bringing in revenue, what you have is a very glorified hobby and not a business. And hopefully you want it to be a business and you want to be making records, replacing your full-time income with making records. So you have to think a little bit more strategically and business-minded. And one of those first things is knowing when to outsource. So if you found this episode helpful, please share it with a friend. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to continue this conversation, there will be a link to the Discord server in the description wherever you're listening. And until next time, remember, working in music does suck, but with what you learn from this episode, it doesn't have to. Until next time, friends.